In the back, Claudette, the trunk. Now, please. I stared at him. My son's driver, a quiet, grey-haired man named Frank, who had been driving for our family for 11 years, was standing at the rear of the car with the trunk already open, looking at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Not panic, something worse. Certainty. Frank, what on earth? There isn't time. Please, you need to see something and you cannot be seen. I'm asking you to trust me. I was 63 years old, standing in my good wool coat on my son's wedding morning, and a man I trusted completely was asking me to climb into a car trunk. I got in. He draped a moving blanket over me, the kind movers use for furniture, and I heard the trunk click shut above me. The engine started. We moved. I want to tell you that I was calm. I want to tell you that that trusted the process and stayed composed. But the truth is, I lay in that dark, cramped space with my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my teeth, and all I could think about was my son. My Callum, my boy, who at that very moment was probably adjusting his tie in front of a mirror somewhere, thinking today was the best day of his life. Let me back up, because this story doesn't start in a car trunk. It starts 3 months earlier, the first time I met the woman my son was going to marry. Her name was Petra. Petra Anslow, she said, though she said the last name so quickly the first time, like it was something she was trying to get past. Callum brought her to Thanksgiving dinner at my house in Barrie, Ontario, and she walked in carrying a bottle of Ontario Riesling and a smile that was just a little too wide and a little too practiced for someone meeting their boyfriend's mother for the first time. I noticed. I always notice. 31 years as a social worker will do that to you, but I told myself I was being unfair. Callum was 41 years old. He had been through a long stretch of loneliness after his marriage to his university girlfriend ended quietly 6 years ago. No children, no business, just two people who had grown in different directions. He'd spent years throwing himself into work. He was an engineer with a firm in Toronto that did infrastructure consulting and dating only occasionally and without much conviction. And then Petra. He lit up around her. That's the only way I can describe it. The particular light that comes into a person's face when they're near someone they love. I had seen it in my late husband Arthur before he passed, and I saw it now in my son. And it made my heart hurt in two directions at once. Happy because he was happy. Afraid because she didn't seem real to me. Still, I said nothing. My daughter, who lives out in Kelowna with her husband and their two boys, called me after I texted her my concerns. "Mum," she said, "you do this with everyone he dates. You did it with the teacher from Collingwood, and she was perfectly lovely." She was lovely, I agreed. Petra is not lovely. Petra is performing. Maybe she's just nervous. Maybe. I let it go. The wedding came together fast. Too fast, I thought, but Callum said Petra didn't want a long engagement and he didn't see any reason to wait. The ceremony was booked at a small inn in Creemore, beautiful place, stone walls, garden ceremony, for the first Saturday of June. 60 guests. Simple, elegant, very them, Callum said. I met Frank for coffee 6 weeks before the wedding. He had driven Callum since Callum moved to Toronto, and over the years he had become something more than a driver, a trusted presence, the kind of older man who knows when to talk and when not to. He seemed distracted that day. I asked if everything was all right. "Fine," he said. But his eyes said something else. I should have pressed him then. I didn't. The week before the wedding, something happened that I couldn't make fit anywhere in my head. I had gone to Toronto for a Friday lunch with Callum, just the two of us, one of our regular traditions, and I arrived at his condo a few minutes early. The concierge knew me and let me up. I knocked. No answer. I used the spare key Callum had given me years ago, intending to just wait inside. The dining table was covered in papers. Bank statements, loan documents. I didn't mean to look closely, but I saw enough. Callum's name, a line of credit I didn't know existed, a figure that stopped my breath. Just under $140,000. When Callum came in 40 minutes later, I asked about it calmly. "Pre-wedding expenses," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "The inn, the caterers, flights for her family. She has some people coming from out east." I said I'd cover it. "Callum, that's not pre-wedding expenses." That's a second mortgage. He smiled in the way people smile when they don't want a conversation to go further. I've got it handled, Mum, don't worry. I drove home to Barry that evening with a stone in my chest. The night before the wedding, Frank called me. He spoke quietly, like someone making sure they weren't overheard. He told me that over the past few weeks, while driving Petra to various appointments and errands, he had noticed things. Small things at first, the way she'd go quiet whenever she passed certain neighborhoods, the way she asked once if he ever talked to Callum about his passengers. Then bigger things. A man who met her outside a coffee shop on Bloor Street and spoke to her in a low, urgent voice while she stood with her arms crossed and her face doing something Frank described as, and this was his word, cornered. He had written down the man's license plate. He had a friend, a retired OPP officer, who had done him a favor. The woman Callum was marrying tomorrow was not Petra Anslow. Her real name was involved in an ongoing fraud investigation out of Nova Scotia. She had used at least 2 different identities in the past 4 years. She had a daughter, a little girl, maybe 5 or 6 years old, who was being raised by the girl's father in Halifax, a man Petra had not legally divorced. Not because the divorce was pending, because she had never filed, which meant that whatever happened tomorrow in that garden in Creemore, Callum would not be legally married, but he would be emotionally destroyed, and financially, looking at those bank statements, possibly ruined. I did not sleep that night. I called my daughter at midnight. She was quiet for a long time. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "I don't know yet," I said, "but I'm not going to do nothing." Frank picked me up the next morning at 7. The wedding wasn't until 2, but Petra had actually requested through Callum that I arrive no earlier than noon, that I not come to the inn in the morning hours while the bridal party was getting ready. She had framed it as wanting space for her girls, not wanting mothers in the mix during hair and makeup. Callum had apologized when he relayed this to me, clearly embarrassed. I had said, of course, no problem, I completely understand. And then I had called Frank. So when Frank came to collect me that morning, we were not going to arrive at noon. We were going at 7:30. And when we turned into the long gravel drive of the inn and Frank spotted a car parked near the garden gate, a black SUV with Nova Scotia plates, he pulled over behind the cedar hedge and looked at me in the rearview mirror. "That's him," Frank said. "The man from the coffee shop." That's when he asked me to get in the trunk. I lay under that moving blanket and I listened. The car stopped. I heard Frank get out. He was going to walk toward the garden, posing as someone checking on the setup, which was plausible enough since he had driven for this family for years. I heard his footsteps on the gravel, slow and even. Then I heard voices. The trunk wasn't fully sealed. There was a small gap near the latch, and though I couldn't see anything, I could hear with terrible clarity. Her voice first, tight, controlled. "You were not supposed to come here." A man's voice, younger than I expected, almost bored. "You stopped answering my calls, Marilyn." "Marilyn, don't call me that. That's your name, unless you filed new papers somewhere." Silence. "He doesn't know about Isla." "No, wait, I know what you named her. I don't need the update. He doesn't know she exists. Does he?" "Not a question. This is not the time or place." "Well, you've made it the time and place, haven't you? Marrying another man while I'm still legally your husband. You want to talk about what that does to child support, to custody, because my lawyer's been very interested in your whereabouts." Her voice dropped so low I almost lost it. "What do you want?" "What I've always wanted. A fair arrangement. For our daughter, you'll get your money." "When?" "After." A long pause. "Then you have 48 hours. After that, I call Callum myself." Footsteps. A car door. The SUV starting up and pulling away on the gravel. I waited. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Frank came back 5 minutes later. He opened the trunk slowly and helped me out, steadying me by the elbow because my legs had gone uncertain beneath me. We stood behind the cedar hedge in the early morning quiet, and I looked at him, and he looked at me. "You heard," he said. "I heard everything." I stood there for a moment with the June morning around me, Birds in the birch trees, the smell of damp grass, somewhere inside the inner kitchen running, the clatter of catering prep. And I thought about my son adjusting his tie in a mirror somewhere inside, thinking this was the best day of his life. "I need to see Callum," I said, "alone, before anyone else." Frank nodded. He knew the inn well enough. He brought me in through the kitchen entrance, past two catering staff who barely glanced up, down a short hallway, and knocked on the door of the room where Callum was getting ready with his best man. A childhood friend named Theo. No, I won't use that name, someone else. Let me think. A man named Garrett, who had driven up from Guelph the night before. Frank spoke quietly to Garrett through a barely open door. A moment later, Garrett came out, nodded at me with a look that asked no questions, and walked away down the hall. I went in. Callum was standing at the window in his dress shirt, jacket not yet on, looking out at the garden where in a few hours he would stand and wait for her to walk toward him. He turned when I came in, and his face did something complicated. Surprised. Uncertain. A little wary, the way your face goes when your mother appears somewhere she wasn't supposed to be. "Mum, you weren't supposed to—" "I know. Sit down." He sat. I sat across from him, and I looked at my son, this man I had raised, who had his father's jaw and his grandmother's stubbornness, and more kindness in him than almost anyone I had ever met in 63 years. And I felt the weight of what I was about to do settle on me like something physical. I told him everything. Not quickly, not in a rush. I told him about Frank's concerns, about the retired officer and the license plate, about what Frank had found. I told him what I had heard with my own ears 10 minutes ago from the trunk of a car behind a cedar hedge. He didn't speak. He just looked at me, and then he looked at his hands, and then he stood up and walked to the window again. "Marilyn," he said quietly, like he was testing the word. "That appears to be her name." He was quiet for a long time. Outside, a caterer crossed the garden with a folding table, setting up for the reception. "There's a little girl," I said gently. He nodded. He already knew I'd said it. He was just letting it land. "She's in Halifax, with her father." I paused. "With the man Petra, or Marilyn, is still legally married to." Callum turned around. His eyes were dry, which I found more heartbreaking than if he'd cried. He just looked tired, the way people look when they realize that something they thought was solid has been hollow the whole time. "The money," he said. "We'll figure out the money. $140,000, Mum. I know. We'll figure it out." He nodded slowly. Then he said something I have thought about many times since. "I need to be the one to talk to her." I hesitated. Every instinct I had said, don't let him go in there alone, but he was 41 years old and he was not asking my permission. "Okay," I said, "stay close, but let me do this." He put on his jacket. He adjusted his tie in the mirror, the very image I had been picturing all morning, and then he walked out. I followed at a distance with Frank beside me. We waited in the corridor near the bridal suite. What happened inside that room? Callum told me afterward. And I'll tell it to you the way he told it to me. He knocked. Petra opened the door. She was already in her dress, hair done, face made up perfectly. She saw his expression and her own face shifted, just slightly. A recalibration, like a person who has been caught but isn't certain how much has been caught. "Callum, you're not supposed to see me before Marilyn," he said. She went still. He told her what he knew. He told her about the man in the black SUV. He told her about the Nan in the black SUV. He told her he knew about the daughter in Halifax. He told her he knew she was still legally married. She tried several things. First, denial. Then a version of the truth that cast herself as a victim. She had been trying to get away from a controlling situation. She had panicked. She had meant to sort it all out before the wedding. She had meant to tell him. She had been about to tell him. Callum listened to all of it, and then he said very quietly, "I need you to leave. Not the wedding. The inn. The town." He needed her to go. She looked at him for a long moment, and then, to her credit, the only credit I can give her, she didn't argue. She asked for 10 minutes. He waited in the hallway. She came out with a small bag, the dress replaced by street clothes, the perfect makeup somehow still in place because it was the kind of makeup that doesn't cry off. She passed me in the corridor. She looked at me once. I didn't say anything. There was nothing left to say. Frank walked her to the door. I stood with my son in the corridor of a beautiful inn in Creemore on the first Saturday of June, and neither of us spoke for a while. 60 guests were arriving at 2 o'clock. There was a caterer in the garden, and a florist finishing the arch, and a photographer somewhere on the grounds checking his light. Callum looked at me and said, "I'm going to need you to help me make some phone calls." So we did. He called Garrett first, then his closest cousin, who helped us set up a quiet arrangement with the inn manager, a kind woman named Sheila, who had seen more than a few surprises in her years running events, and who handled the whole thing with tremendous tact. Guests were reached before they left home. Those who were already driving were called on their mobiles. The ceremony was cancelled. A late lunch was offered to the small number of people who had already arrived in the garden as planned, with good food and wine from the Niagara region and conversation that was gentle and did not press. Callum sat at the head of the long garden table in his wedding suit, and I sat beside him. And at one point he leaned over and said to me, "You know you're going to have to tell me exactly how Frank managed to get you into the trunk without you knocking him unconscious." I laughed for the first time all day. As for what happened afterward, Callum retained a lawyer. The money was complicated and took time, but not all of it was lost. There were certain protections that Canadian consumer law provided once the circumstances of the fraud were established, and Callum's firm was good to him during a hard few months. He was back to himself by autumn, not healed exactly, but himself. Frank retired the following spring. At his retirement dinner, Callum stood up and gave a toast that was mostly about Frank's steadiness and calm over 11 years of driving, and at the end he said something like, "This man saw something I couldn't see, and he did something about it," which is all any of us can hope for from the people around us. I thought about that for a long time. I think about it still. Because what I keep coming back to is not the woman in the corridor with her small bag, or the man in the black SUV, or the $140,000. What I keep coming back to is my son at that window in the morning light, looking out at the garden with a future he still believed in, and the impossibility of what a parent is asked to hold sometimes. The knowledge you carry that your child doesn't have yet, the question of when to speak, and when to wait, and when to get into a car trunk, because a man you trust is looking at you with certainty in his eyes. I got it right this time. I know I did. But I'm still not entirely sure how.